Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome. Just going to give it a couple moments as people join. Happy Tuesday. Hello, welcome if you're just tuning in. We'll get started in a moment. All right. Well, it looks like attendance is kind of leveling off, so I can get us started. Welcome to, speaking of getting us started, welcome to Getting Started with Obsolete Media. My name is Greg Stewart. I'm the Education Program Manager here at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, or CCAHA, as we say, and I use they and he pronouns. For accessibility's sake, I will say that I'm a white person with dark hair and glasses. I'm wearing a purple striped top, and I have a mural in my background that has animals and plants and stairs on it. Um, and just a bit more about our webinar that you are tuning into today. So basically, many collections, as you well know, include audiovisual and digital materials in formats that are no longer widely supported, such as VHS tapes, audio cassettes, and floppy disks. These materials often raise practical questions. Is this still playable? Can we manage it in-house, or do we need outside help? This introductory webinar walks you through the basics of working with obsolete media. Topics include identifying common at-risk formats, understanding file conversion options, thinking through equipment needs, and deciding when an outside vendor is the right choice. And the emphasis is based on realistic decision-making for small or volunteer-run organizations. So before we get into the presentation, just some Zoom housekeeping. So you are in Zoom webinar, which means your video and audio are turned off, but you can ask questions or make comments to us in the chat. Today's program is auto closed caption in English, which you can turn on with the little CC button in the Zoom toolbar. Thanks to those of you who've submitted questions in advance. We've used those to shape the presentation today, which is great. I love that. But don't worry if you didn't get a chance to submit questions. We'll have the presentation from our speaker followed by Q&A with you. So once again, please feel free to ask those questions anytime during the program, and I'll be reading them off verbally at the end. This program is being recorded, and we'll send the recording as well as the PowerPoint and any other resources we've shared in a follow-up email. So if Kaitlyn, if you could go to the next slide,
Sure.
please. So just one quick note about the organization we work for, CCAHA. We are a regional conservation lab and preservation services facility. We're based here in Philadelphia, but we work with organizations and clients all across the country. And our conservators treat paper-based objects like books, photographs, documents, artwork on paper, and more. And our preservation services staff work in the field, providing education programs like this one and helping institutions plan for the future of their collections. The center also offers a wide range of digitization services, as well as fundraising assistance, housing, framing, and more. And you can learn more about what we do at our website, ccaha.org. So a bit more about our speaker today. As the digital archive specialist, Kaitlyn Pettengill conducts digital preservation assessments and assists with digitization planning for collecting organizations. She advises organizations in the ongoing development, implementation, and operation of their digital preservation programs, as well as on recommendations for the development and implementation of digital preservation strategies, technologies, and procedures. Prior to joining the CCHA staff in 2024, Kaitlyn worked as the digital projects coordinator for the Atwater Kent Collection at Drexel University and as the Digital Services Archivist at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Kaitlyn earned an MLIS from San José State University, where she specialized in digital collections and digital asset management. She also holds an MA degree in History of Art from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London and a BA in Art History and English Literature from Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kaitlyn.
Great. Thank you, Greg. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kaitlyn Pettengill. For description, I am a woman with dark blonde hair and light skin tone. I'm wearing a blue sweater, and my background is a bookcase filled with books. So thank you for joining today's session on getting started with obsolete media. Today, we're going to focus on risk, decision-making, and realistic planning for small and mid-sized institutions. I'm going to try and keep this, not highly technical. It's about more understanding what you're dealing with and making informed choices. I'm going to provide a lot of resources for you to learn more or to take your first steps working with obsolete media. And if you have specific questions about your collection, you're welcome to email with me with them afterwards. So first, what is obsolete media? Obsolete media is what becomes obsolete when the hardware is no longer being manufactured, when software is not supported any longer, and when knowledge of use has disappeared. So obsolescence is less about the age and more about what we might call dependency chains. It's the things that are required in order to actually use the item. So if it's a VHS, you need to have a VHS player. If you want to open a Flash file, then you have to have software that can open it, things like that. A format becomes obsolete when the system required to access it begins to disappear. So that system might include the equipment, ports to connect. Our laptops keep changing, and you can no longer use the things you had before because they'll no longer plug in. Operating systems or institutional expertise. People don't know how to use a floppy anymore sometimes. So if you cannot reasonably access something using what you currently have, it's effectively become obsolete for your institution. And I have a couple of examples here. On the top left, we've got a 3.5-inch micro floppy disk, which was common during the late 1980s through the early 2000s. It's something that a lot of collections have if they've been around for a little while. Next to it is a secure digital or SD camera card. It's flash-based storage. It feels modern, but it's already begun to be considered kind of obsolete. To the right, there's a whole stack of hard drives, both what we'd call traditional spinning disk hard drives and solid state drives. And then on the lower left, that is an iOmega zip disk, which was once marketed as, the improved version of a floppy disk. But each of these represents a different generation of storage technology, and each one needs different hardware, different connections, and different software. And just kind of as an aside, I'm often asked which is more secure, a traditional hard drive or a solid state drive. A traditional hard drive, which is sometimes called an HDD, uses spinning magnetic disks and mechanical read-write heads. Because it has moving parts, it can become vulnerable to mechanical failure, shock, or wear over time. A solid state drive or SSD has no moving parts. It uses flash memory chips, but that makes it more resistant to physical shock. However, they can sometimes fail suddenly without warning, and they're not designed for long-term archival storage. You really don't need to know that. Because people sometimes ask, I just wanted to give a very brief rundown. It's not going to show up elsewhere in the presentation. Both are working storage devices, and neither should be treated as long-term storage for collections. You want to use them, as you're working actively, but not long-term storage. So the key takeaway is this: no storage medium is permanent. Security comes from having multiple copies, from documenting things, and from managing the life cycle of the obsolete media and digital files. It's not from the device itself. So formats, obsolete versus endangered. Obsolete media formats are information storage formats that are no longer supported or manufactured. I know it kind of sounds jargony. I just mean any of the things we've just talked about, VHS, floppies, they're Betamax, they're all obsolete these days. Whereas endangered media formats are things that are not yet obsolete, but they're at high risk. We know they're going to become obsolete. These days, that could be a DVD or a CD. People don't have CD drives on their laptops. It's going to become less and less common that you'll have access to it. People won't manufacture them anymore. So they're at risk. And there's two different responses that you can take. There's media migration, when you're transferring the files to a new carrier. So you're taking that VHS, you're digitizing it, you're saving it as something else. And format migration is when you convert the file. So say you get you've got an old floppy and it's got what we would call born digital. So it's things that never existed outside of a computer. It's saved on that floppy, but it's saved as an older file format that's harder to open these days. And I'll get into this later. But you would not be transferring it to different media necessarily. Well, you would, but that's not the only thing you'd be doing. You'd also be having to convert it into a new format altogether. So it's a different file format that you're transferring it into. So it's important to distinguish between those two. You're probably doing them together, but they're separate processes. And they solve different problems, and they're not interchangeable. So media versus access risk. Everything we're discussing today falls into one of two categories: media risk or access risk. And the response depends on which type of failure you're dealing with. So digital materials rarely disappear all at once. They can degrade or become inaccessible through different mechanisms depending on the storage medium and the systems that are required. So I'm going to break down a few different things that put media at risk. Bit rot. There is it's corruption at the binary level. So all files are made up of ones and zeros, the bits. And over time, some of those bits can change due to the hardware aging, or it's in unstable storage, or there's environmental factors, extreme fluctuations in temperature that can impact it. So the file might open, but it displays errors, or it only opens partially, or it just fails entirely. And again, we'll get into this a little bit more in detail. Disk rot is like it sounds like it's disk media like CDs or DVDs. So the layers can degrade based on when they were made. They're made from different materials, and some of them are more stable than others. It can get very specific to whenever a particular CD or DVD was manufactured, how strong it is, how resilient it is. And when the metal begins to degrade, it makes the data unreadable. So the damage might not be visible to your eye, but you'll find out when you go and try and play it. So the response to that would be to migrate all the files off before there's any kind of failure. Link rot is the loss of access to online content when links break or stop working. So for web archiving, it can be a real problem, because if you link out to different sites, they're no longer, the links don't work anymore, or they become they get put behind paywalls. So link rot is when you no longer have access to links in newspaper articles or blogs or anything like that. Access risk, that's two major types: technical obsolescence and software obsolescence. Technical obsolescence is about the hardware. It's the actual physical hard drive, or it's the playback equipment, which would be the VHS machine or the CD player, or Betamax, anything like that. And it's no longer compatible with current systems. And then software obsolescence is about the software that's needed to open the files. So the file still exists, but you can't get the software that's needed to open it properly. So different storage media fail in different ways. Nothing is immune, and the strategy depends on what kind of failure you're having to deal with. A few images again to show the different types of failure that I just described. The upper left, you can see an example of bit rot. I use this illustration a lot because you've got on the left the original image, but when you flip just one or two bits, you can see how it becomes completely corrupted. The one in the middle is just 2 bits have been flipped, and then the one on the end is 4 bits have been flipped, and that's out of however many bits are required to create that image. It's a small difference, but it has a huge impact. In the upper right, you can see an example of disk rot. So the physical layers of the CD are degrading and making the data unreadable, even if the disk appears to be okay at a quick glance. On the lower left, that's the Google 404 image for link rot. So when the web content has moved or become inaccessible, you're not going to be able to follow that link anymore. And in the lower right, that's the Betamax tape. The content still exists in the tape, but if you can't find equipment to play it, it's effectively lost to you. So each of these represents a different way that you might have trouble accessing the collection material. The underlying problem is not always visible to you until you try and access it. So carrier failure, that's again the media, that's just lots of different terms for the same thing. But carrier failure refers to the storage medium itself when the physical object begins to degrade. So it's things like disk rot that I already mentioned. Binder breakdown can happen with film. Environmental damage can cause problems if you've got big fluctuations in temperature or in humidity. If you kept CDs in your car, that's a good way for them to fail. You know, as I would always burn CDs and play them in my car. And if you have them out in a hot car in the middle of the summer, that's a good way for them to fail. The problem is not that the file format is obsolete. The problem is that the storage material itself is deteriorating. Magnetic media can be a real problem. It can have something that it's called sticky shed syndrome, which is where the chemical binder holding the magnetic particles begins to degrade. And like I said, heat, humidity, light exposure, even magnetic fields can be a problem that accelerates the different processes. So carrier failure is often very gradual. Materials might appear to be intact until you attempt to access them. And the response to carrier failure is stabilize the item as much as you can, improve the storage conditions, have it somewhere that that doesn't experience big temperature fluctuations, that doesn't experience a lot of changes in humidity, that's dark and cool. You want to create extra copies if you can, because if one fails, then you have a backup. You want to migrate content off of any unstable media before failure gets worse. And different storage types can fail in different ways, but none of them are immune. So understanding the distinction between these different failure types will hopefully help you to understand what kind of intervention is needed. All right, getting a little bit more into bit rot. One of the questions that somebody asked was, recently I heard a term I hadn't heard before, digital rot. In layman's terms, what is it and what can be done about it? So in everyday language, when people say digital rot, they're often referring to what we could call bit rot. So it's really the same thing. It occurs at that binary level, those ones and zeros that make up the file. It's often only detected when you're trying to access something like that image down in the lower right. And it's more common if you haven't checked on the storage device, you've had it on a hard drive and you've kind of let it sit for 10 years, they have a lifespan. And so that's the kind of thing where you come back and you realize that something has happened. So again, having multiple copies is the best way to deal with that. All right, a little bit more about disk rot, just to show you two examples. Again, it's the physical layer failure, it's delamination or die breakdown. Disks that were professionally manufactured, so they were already burnt. When you got them, music CDs, things like that, they are often more stable than the ones that you got and you were able to burn yourself. Those have a much shorter lifespan. So if your collection has CDs from your office where you were saving office files, or if somebody donated photos on a CD that they had burnt themselves, that's going to be at a higher risk than something that was professionally produced. It's often irreversible once it begins. So the response there is really to prioritize migrating anything that's off of that type of media if you're able to. And a little bit more again about magnetic media failure. Magnetic media can have physical and chemical instability. You've got the sticky shed. It's time sensitive. when it was produced doesn't always indicate how at risk it is. There's things that are older that are much more stable than things that are more recent. So with printed photos, for example, photos that were printed in the earlier days of photography in the 20s, they are much more stable than Polaroids. So you really have to do a little bit of research and dig in a little bit to what you've got, because how old it is doesn't always indicate how stable it's going to be. So don't experiment, especially with media. That's probably a harder thing to manage in-house. If it gets a little bit trickier than, say, audio cassettes, you probably want to consider a vendor more for magnetic media than you do for things like discs. All right, getting back into technical obsolescence, it's when there's no working playback equipment, you've got no ability to interface, you've got incompatible operating systems, you've got device drivers that are no longer supported, you can't download them, or hardware that's very difficult to find. So the media may actually be intact, but your ability to access them is what you don't have any longer. So access failure is really what we're talking about. So you might have a zip disk, but you don't have a functioning zip drive. You might have a mini DV tape, but you can't find a compatible deck to play it on. It's not a decay problem so much as an ecosystem problem. And then software obsolescence, again, it's the format or platform dependency failure. So it's file formats that were proprietary. That means that they were created by a company that didn't tell people what the file format consists of, so that it can't be understood in the same way. The opposite of that is open source. So proprietary file formats, if the company goes out of business or it no longer supports it, it's much more difficult. Say Adobe goes out of business, Photoshop files might be harder to access than some other software. Unsupported audio or video formats, unsupported applications. Things are very dependent on a platform. The way that something displays on a computer, an Apple computer from the 80s is very different from how it would display on a modern computer, even if you are able to get access to it. And then cloud-based systems with no clear way to export, so they're just sort of stuck. So that kind of leads me in a little bit to the Digital Preservation Coalition's global bit list, which is something that I really enjoy. They have this list of endangered digital materials, which identifies the digital content that is at the highest risk. So it'll cover things like if it's proprietary or open source, if it depends on a particular platform, if there are copyright or legal constraints, or if it's very difficult to preserve. So they have categories from vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, or practically extinct. For example, if anybody remembers Adobe Flash animations, they're now listed as practically extinct because the platform is no longer supported. And digital archives for community groups are listed as critically endangered, not because the media itself has decayed, but because community groups often lack the resources needed to long-term preserve their own digital archives. So things are listed on the bit list as at risk for a multitude of reasons. And it's not always about physical degradation. It's more about business models, lack of funding, unsupported formats. So when you encounter a file type or a system that seems unfamiliar to you, the question might be, is it simply old, or is it part of a broader recognized risk pattern that the Digital Preservation Coalition has already identified? So you want to think a little bit broader. It's more about the systemic risk than a single file. Collection level triage. Rot and obsolescence are natural parts of any digital life cycle. Digital is not, it's less stable than the physical. So people will say, if I digitize it, it's preserved. No. In some cases, the original is going to last longer. You know, newspapers from the 1700s are going to last longer than the images that we take of them if we don't maintain those digital images very carefully. You can't prevent rot and obsolescence from happening, but you can plan so that losing access to one copy isn't going to mean that you lose everything. You want to kind of have a clear sense of what you have and what's most at risk so that you can plan on doing things like migrating as you need to. And you know where to put your resources, because if you're a small institution, you're not going to just go and move everything all at once. It's not achievable. It's too much work. It's too difficult. It's too expensive. So you know where you need to put your resources. You know what's most at risk. Setting priorities is essential. The major factor is whether something is volatile, but it's also about the likelihood that you'll be able to access the playback machine. So if it's Betamax, the Betamax itself is probably pretty secure, but how are you going to find the playback machine to actually access it and actually view it? And then it's also, of course, you need to consider how essential something is going to be to your institution, your mission. And I know it can be really difficult when you don't necessarily know what's on something. Is the label correct? Does it even have a label? It can be difficult to know what you really need to prioritize if you don't know what's physically on something. And you have to get access to it in order to know if it was worth putting your resources into accessing it. It's a little difficult. All right, born digital risks. This was another question that came in from somebody. Thank you so much for submitting your questions. It was, can you speak to obsolete formats for born digital materials or share guidance on preserving born digital materials at risk of obsolescence? Which materials are most at risk and how can small institutions prepare? So I've covered that a little bit. Again, born digital risks include the software and platform dependency, those proprietary or undocumented file formats. Nobody knows what went into it. Cloud storage that you can't figure out how to easily export. Access systems that have passwords. Somebody's donated something to you, but you don't know what the passwords are, or it's your institution just had a lot of staff turnover and you can no longer access something because it's behind passwords that you don't have. Lack of documentation is always a big issue, no matter what you're talking about in collections, right? Somebody leaves, you don't know what they've already done or how they've done it. And with Born Digital, you also have the added problem of there is no other version that exists that you could redigitize if you had to. This is the only version you have. All right. There is no physical backup copy. So yeah, with a VHS tape or a printed photograph, you could go back and make another one if you had to. But with this is the version that you have. So to make this concrete, again, Born Digital materials include photos that were taken with a digital camera, your emails, Excel spreadsheets, anything that has no original version in the real world. So different from copies that you create with a scanner. Some of them, you can't really print them off and have that be an accurate depiction of what it is. So that's not really a solution. You want to try and preserve the original digital version because that's what it really is. At the bottom there, I've got a little clip from the Library of Congress, their recommended file formats list, which is really excellent. They update it every year. On the left there, you've got, it's of the two lists that have all the different file types, it's the one on the left. So still image works, digital photographs, then there's a list of files. Those are the formats the Library of Congress has identified as preferred by them. And on the right are acceptable formats, not preferred, but not bad. These are designed specifically for the Library of Congress's own collections. So it's not a mandate for small institutions. There might be a lot of file types there that the Library of Congress can handle, but that smaller places really can't, but it's just a good place to go and get started to say, oh, well, the Library of Congress has identified this as being sustainable for them. So kind of that's your starting point. And then you can think about whether or not it's actually usable for you. So generally the formats are openly documented, they're widely in use, they're uncompressed, or they're what we call losslessly compressed, because when you compress a file to save space, there's two different types. There's lossy and lossless. So you don't want to have anything that's lossy. And things that are more likely to remain accessible over a long time. And digitized surrogates and burned digital material are going to have the same concerns. But with the born digital, the format sustainability can determine whether the content survives at all. So again, really use this not as a checklist, but as a support tool when you're making decisions about what you already have and what you can create going forward. So what to do when you find old media in your collection if you've got a box in the basement that's full of old floppy disks. First, don't plug it in yet, if you even have the ability. So don't test disks in random or unknown drives. Avoid using your office computers, not just because you don't know what's on the file, but you don't know what your computer might do to the file if it starts to open files automatically or it overwrites them. Two is stabilizing them physically. So keep your disks at room temperature, away from heat and sunlight. Don't have them right next to a heater. Keep them away from magnets if you have them. Obviously, that's not like the little ones that go on your fridge, but anything really stronger magnet would be a problem. Leave the labels intact because they're often very critical to understanding what's on something. You can't totally trust them. People would overwrite VHSs all the time. You tape something new, but it's the first point that you want to check when you're trying to figure out what something actually has on it. Step 3, you want to document everything before you do anything. You want to make a basic inventory. You can use a spreadsheet, Google Sheets, or Excel, or even a paper inventory. I want to write down what it is. Maybe it's a 3.5-inch floppy. Write down the label text. If you know the date, maybe there's a little 95 in the corner. You can write that down. If you have any sense of who the creator is. And then if you see if there's any kind of condition issues. So just having that is a huge preservation win. Just having that list is really the first step there. And then 2, making decisions about your path forward. Is it something that you can access in-house? You know, is it you can buy 3.5-inch floppy disk readers for pretty cheap. They're about $18 or so I've seen. So that's something that you could do in-house if you feel comfortable with it because it's not outrageously expensive. But then if you get into things, certain types of film, maybe it's not even just about being able to get access to the equipment, but it would be so expensive. Maybe a vendor is the better choice. And then there's things where maybe you've decided this is stable enough, I'm going to defer this. This is not my number one priority right now. This is going to have to wait when the resources just aren't available to you yet. So, yep, identifying the formats. When you encounter legacy media, the very first question is not how do I digitize this, but what exactly is this thing that I've got? So on this slide, you see the reminder that the format determines the way that you can play it back. And the way you can play it back is going to determine how you're going to try and preserve it. You've got a few examples there of different types of tape formats. I know from a colleague who works with university students told me that she had students bring her a collection they'd found in a closet somewhere, telling her that it was audio tapes. And when they got to her, it was actually mini DVs, which are a video format that is less common, and I guess college students had never encountered it before. So it changed the way that she had to end up getting access to it so that they could actually figure out what was on it. So some formats are still going to be reasonably accessible, and others are going to require rare or expensive equipment. And sometimes just identifying the format is going to determine whether or not it's realistic to handle in-house or if you should consult a vendor. If you have a local university that has a big AV collection, they might be able to assist you if your collection overlaps with theirs in some way. I do know there's some small institutions that were able to go to big local universities and say, can you digitize this for me? And they had the equipment. And that could be a more collaborative and less expensive way of digitizing something than going to a vendor. It just depends. But what you might have, you want to compare physical characteristics like the size. For those videos, it was the cassette window, the way things are labeled. Sometimes there's numbers on there that you can search and figure out what something might be. You can compare things like the thickness. Obviously, with floppy disks, they're by size, so you can measure it in inches. Any manufacturer markings. Really don't guess. If you are able to identify something accurately, that is the best way to go. And on the screen there, I've got a few different really great sites that you can go to that have really good descriptions of different media types and can really help you to identify something. So I will send those around after the webinar is over, and you can visit them if you'd like. So yeah, don't ever experiment with closest looking equipment if you're not sure. Something could get jammed, it could get very damaged. Don't just insert a tape into a deck to see if it fits, obviously. I know that seems like an obvious thing, but using the wrong playback equipment can permanently damage any kind of media. So this is a little harder for places, but I feel like this is one of the easiest things to tackle when you get into born digital. I mean, so obviously CDs are something that people are comfortable with. Maybe floppies are a little bit tougher, but as I said, it's pretty easy to buy a floppy disk reader. You can see an example down there in the lower right. I've purchased one in the last year for under $20. They work with the 3.5-inch floppies, not the older, larger ones, but you're most likely going to see the 3.5s in your collection. And they're a good way to get access and to at least figure out what's on the floppy and if it's even worth your time trying to migrate off. They really are one of the most common legacy formats that institutions are going to encounter. So I have there that write blockers, if available. I'm not going to get into this hugely now. I do have resources on this that will get passed around. You can always ask me with questions. But a write blocker kind of sits in between the computer that you're accessing something on and the, say, the disk reader to prevent your computer from accidentally changing the contents of the disk. Even just simply plugging it in can sometimes change metadata. So if you have a digital photo, you have a date attached to it and you want to make sure that you know that date and it doesn't get altered in any way. But then if you plug it in and your computer opens it automatically, maybe that date gets changed. And so if you use a write blocker, there are both software versions and hardware versions that can protect the floppy or the disk, whatever it is that you're using. So also, what does not work? You don't want to ever try and use moldy or physically warped disks. They're going to fail. They might get jammed in the reader. Disks that were written on obsolete computer systems might require more advanced tools. You want to be careful with handling. You never want to force a disk into a drive. And if you hear any kind of grinding noises or unusual noises, you want to stop immediately. And avoid kind of opening the disk up unless you're specifically trained to do so. And finally, expectation setting. Some floppy disks are going to fail. Magnetic media is going to degrade. And your goal is not to save absolutely everything. It's to maximize the number of things that you're able to successfully access and to capture as much as you reasonably can. But 100% success is not something that you're going to see. All right, after you've managed to retrieve data, now what? The next risk is what we would call the we copied it and forgot it problem. Just because you were able to extract the files does not mean that they're preserved automatically. So first you move the files off of the media. Um, the floppy disk, the USB drive, is not long-term storage. Next, you store the files on managed storage. So by that, I mean a system that is going to be regularly backed up, that you're monitoring it and you're maintaining it. A good solution is multiple. So it's what we call the 3-2-1, which means 3 copies on 2 different storage types with one stored off-site. So in the old days, that used to mean that 2 different libraries might, in different geographical locations, might mail each other their backup. So they, be physically mailing a hard drive with the backup to another institution. But these days, the cloud is that that off-site option, so that if you've got any kind of natural disaster, the cloud version at least is secure from that. And also saving it onto a local system is good too. I mean, you want to have copies living on separate devices. You want to do basic file management, keep the original file names, especially if there's any kind of logic to them. Do not immediately clean up and rename everything. Instead, you want to document it. Try to see if you can figure out what the logic was. Longer term, you can plan for the format review and possible migration, but that does not need to happen immediately. Priority is stabilization and making sure to integrate all of this into a broader plan rather than treating it as a one-time recovery project. So the retrieval is really the beginning of stewarding this new collection, not the end. Now, up to this, I've talked about identifying formats, retrieving data, stabilizing files, but the next step is really digging into documentation. A digital asset register is a simple but really powerful tool. It documents what you have, where it lives on your own systems, if you have that backup in the cloud, what format it is, what media it's stored on, and what risks are associated. And that includes both born digital files and the physical media if you haven't transferred files off of it yet. So it can be, as I said, a structured spreadsheet on Excel, or just if you're keeping track on paper, that's fine as well. But you can't manage risk across your collection if you don't know what formats exist and where they're stored. If you're receiving born digital content on physical media, there's a guide that was published back in 2012, so a while ago now, but it's still a very good overview. It's called "You've Got to Walk Before You Can Run," and again, I'll share that out. What's valuable about that is not the specific tools that it references, because some of them have changed, but it's about creating a workflow. And it starts with stabilizing things, documenting what you have, working from the copies, not the originals, so that you can't accidentally damage the original, having a chain of custody, and all of that stays true no matter when we begin to do this work. So the fact that it's I don't know, 14 years old now, it's still a really good overview of how to structure the migration. All right, so somebody had asked, what are best practices for storing obsolete media, i.e. film versus tapes versus CDs? What is the best way to name and label tapes with unknown content? We don't want to we don't want to label the tapes themselves. You obviously you want to label whatever it's being held in, the housing, and you can just put unknown, unaccessible for now, and that is fine. Just at least then somebody knows that you so far don't know what's on something. So unknown is an appropriate way to label it. Just record the things that you do know. And again, storing obsolete media, well, if you've transferred things that are off of it and you no longer need the physical copy, it's not interesting to you, it doesn't have enough of a label to be valuable, you can recycle things once you know that you have a good digital copy. But if you do want to preserve the original, then like I said, keep it out of the light, keep it somewhere that is not going to have a lot of heat, and humidity fluctuations, and there's a really good guide to knowing what type of media needs what type of storage. For audiovisual especially. So again, I'll share that around afterwards. All right. DIY or vendor. I've covered this a little bit so far. The decision is rarely just about equipment cost because there's a lot of hidden costs to trying to do it yourself. There's your staff time. There's having to keep up the equipment. I mean, legal exposure is not really an issue for most small collections, but I would say staff time and expertise are really the major ones. But when it might actually make sense to do it yourself is if it's something that you feel comfortable accessing. You know, it's something like a CD that people are comfortable with. You're creating access copies and not long-term preservation copies. You're going to do a little pilot to see how it feels and how well it works for you. And when you know something about the collection already, you have some metadata, you have some knowledge about what's on there, especially if it's something like a photo collection, maybe the vendor isn't able to give you really rich descriptions because they're not familiar with this collection and you are. So a vendor becomes more appropriate when you're dealing with really rare formats, media that's in very bad condition, you know, audiovisual equipment, material that's really begun to degrade, or it has sticky shed syndrome. It's something that's very valuable to you, so you're worried about trying to do it in-house and you want the vendor to try instead, or when you lack, you know, really reliable playback equipment. So working with vendors, if you do decide to go that route, you want to have a really strong, clear agreement about how you're going to handle things like file naming, like metadata. Are they going to create a transcription for you? Are they going to be recording metadata, or are they just making a file and giving it to you that way? If they're able to do some basic metadata creation, it can save you a lot of time because they're going to have to do that in-house anyway for themselves to manage the project. And what are they turning over to you? And is it in a format that you can use? Sometimes metadata is embedded in files. It'll take, I mean, when they create the new file, I'm sorry, I don't mean the original. So they can embed some metadata into the new file so that it is, it's not going to be separatable. And that can include basic information about the file itself. And so you want to talk to them about whether they're able to do that and how much they're going to charge to do things like that. The more work that they put into it, the more they're going to charge, I'm sure. But you want to have a lot of clarity about what they'll be doing for you. And are they going to name it in a way that works for your organization, or are they naming it somehow that works for them internally? Just to have some clarity on that. What are your expectations? You know, how are they going to handle the materials? How are they going to ship them? Do they have insurance? What's going to happen if something's damaged? How are they going to give the metadata to you? Is it going to come in as a spreadsheet? Or do they, you know, have a database that they use that's not going to be easily accessible to you? Are they delivering files on hard drive, or are they going to try and transfer them electronically over the cloud? You know, who's responsible for all of that? So working with a vendor is not about just paying them to digitize the collection. You're entering into a partnership for this collection, and you want to make sure that when the files come back, you can actually integrate them into your system without having to redo everything. All right. Conversion basics. It's a policy decision. It should include both preservation copies and access copies. You know, you're making decisions about the quality, the file formats, the storage capacity, the cost, long-term access. You want to make sure that all of those things align with your priorities as an organization, not just what equipment is available to you. So try and include both preservation copies and access copies if you're able to. They're not the same thing. Preservation copy is a high quality, you know, it's uncompressed or losslessly compressed. It's intended to serve as a long-term preservation master that prioritizes, you know, future usability. The access copy is optimized for use now, so it's something that you can share easily over the internet. If you want to do that, you can put it into a different, like if you want to use something like the Digital Public Library of America, or if you want to host things yourself on a Mecca, like the access copy is a smaller, compressed copy that's much easier to share or download. But if you only create the access copy, then you're limiting future reuse. And if you only create the preservation copy, you might make access unnecessarily difficult. So ideally, you're going to plan for both from the beginning. And you can refer back to that Library of Congress recommended formats to decide what format you'll use for your preservation copy and your access copy. Preservation copies for images, TIFFs are preferred for that, whereas like a JPEG might be preferred for the access copy. It really depends on the format, but that recommended formats site is very helpful for making those decisions. Now, you also want to consider, the physical carrier's condition. If the tape is moldy, brittle, sticky, or warped, conversion might require that you have to go to a conservator in order to stabilize something ahead of time, or a professional vendor that has a conservator on staff. Attempting to play back something without addressing that condition can just permanently damage the item. What playback machines are required? Not just the format, but the exact machine that's going to be required. Some formats require very, very specific models, and not all machines are interchangeable. What connecting items are needed? The cords or adapters that you need in order to hook up the playback machine to your modern computer. And you need to have software that's able to capture the signal or encode the file to monitor quality. Conversion's not just about pressing record. It's all of these things. So it can start to feel very complicated, especially when you get into really niche items. So before beginning, it's worth asking, do we understand the risks? Do we understand what's required? And do we have the capacity to do it? Because once you convert something, you're not just creating a file, you're trying to commit to preserving that file going forward. Now, I'm not going to cover this very much because this is a little bit more advanced, but just to let you know that this is something to look at. Before migrating or converting anything, you want to have a clear sense of what you're dealing with. So up to now, I've been talking mostly about physical identifying things by their appearance, and it's like the tapes and the discs and the drives. This is the digital equivalent of that. Excuse me. You want to identify the file format. If it's something like a PDF or a doc, it's pretty easy. We're all familiar with those. But there are some long disused file formats that nobody's familiar with. And Droid was created by the National Archives of the United Kingdom. It's really great. It helps you to identify the different file formats. And then there's Pronom, which is also National Archives. It's a database of all of the file formats that anyone has ever encountered. So the Library of Congress one that I recommended is kind of consistent, easy, short list of the things that you can try and work with. Pronom's going to cover everything that you might ever encounter. Huge list. It's just something to check if you come across something that you're not familiar with and you can't find elsewhere. So they're a little more advanced, but I just wanted everyone to be familiar with them. All right, practical next steps, just summing everything up. Inventory what you have, create your digital asset register. Spreadsheet is fine. Include the metadata type, the format if you know it, the approximate date, the storage location and labels. Identify the risk, flag at-risk media formats or systems. Note any specific equipment requirements. I think this is a mini DV, so I need to have access to a mini DV camcorder or something like that. Stabilize the storage by having at least 2 copies in different locations. Remove the files off of the media if you can into something that's longer term, that's better for long-term storage. And plan ahead, because you're always going to have to keep migrating things. Just because it's in a better format now doesn't mean that it's good forever. You have to come back and refer to things. So set up a schedule to regularly check on the media and make sure that things are still secure. So if you're looking for templates, again, the Digital Preservation Coalition has the Digital Asset Register Toolkit. It includes a really good adaptable example of what a digital asset register might look like. And it's a great place to get started. So again, I'll share that around. For the resources, these are all things I've mentioned in passing. To identify obsolete media and devices, the Museum of Obsolete Media is great because it has a lot of photos of everything, so you can refer to the photo as well as measurements and descriptions. DIPSNY also has the identifying endangered media formats video that you can watch on YouTube. And then for born digital media, again, I mentioned the digital species list, the bit list, Library of Congress recommended formats, and then there's a few other archiving guides from LOC that are really helpful. So I'm happy to take any questions that anybody might have, or if there's anything that I didn't cover that you'd like me to talk about now.
Thank you, Kaitlyn. Yeah, we're any and all questions are welcome. I was actually thinking one as you were talking, Kaitlyn, maybe I can start us off, and if people are
Absolutely.
using this time to think about their questions or type. I was curious, I feel like when you were talking about the example of just because something is the same file format from the 80s, it's going to look different, like I think you used the example of something on an Apple computer in the
Mm-hmm.
80s might look different on a newer computer. I'm curious about the viability of like emulators for
Oh, yes.
some of the.
So emulation, yeah, which is when you try and mimic the original presentation as much as possible. Um, it's something that can be hard for small institutions because you need a little bit more tech savvy, and it's more expensive to maintain. I think it's the Ransom Center in Texas has duplicated Salman Rushdie's computer so that you have the same experience as he would have sitting at his computer in the 90s. Like you can even go in and see his Minesweeper scores. Everything's organized that way. It's an intellectually interesting way to deal with stuff, but I feel like it's not very practical for most places. So you want to think about what it is that you have and what the important parts of it are. So if it's a Word doc, maybe you save it as a PDF because it's just about the letters on the page. But if it's digital art, if it's media, something that's like really interactive, then that might be worth putting in more resources and being able to actually emulate the way that the artist intended it to be viewed. And that can be hard to distinguish when you're coming back to something late. If there hasn't been communication, all along, it might be really hard to even figure out how something was meant to be originally played. Yeah, it's a tough thing for smaller institutions to dive into.
Yeah, that makes sense. We have a question here. Do you have a suggestion for how many years to plan for digital migration from one format to another?
Depends a little bit on the format. A lot of hard drives, they'll say that they have between 5 and 10 years. I think that if you keep everything in a good temperature stable, humidity stable, dark environment, that you can plan for more like the 10 years. But I would suggest checking on things before that. Have a more regular review and then plan to definitely migrate things off within that 10-year mark. It depends so much on the media. It's hard for me to give specifics because there are so many little variations. But hard drives in particular, which is one way that people are one thing that people are migrating collections onto. You'll see 5, 7, or 10 years. If you can migrate more frequently, more like the 5-year mark, that's probably best, but I know that can be a heavy lift.
Thank you. Maybe I'll take last call for questions if anybody has any burning questions. Here we go. Can we talk a little bit more, or can you talk a little bit more about metadata?
Mm-hmm.
How to save the data so that it's clearly associated with electronic files like photos, videos, and audio.
Sure. So, depending on what computer you have, there's some you can access some of that easily. If you're on a Mac, what is it, sort of preview? You can go to preview, or it's like it might be like File Explorer on a PC, and you'll see some basic metadata, and you can edit it there, or you can use something like Adobe Bridge, which is it costs money to use, but it's very easy to add more metadata to a collection, and you can batch update. So you can say, I have a collection of 100 photos and they all came from the same donor. You can use Bridge to batch update, but you do have to pay for it. If that's too complicated, a good option is the Excel spreadsheet. As long as you name your file in a very clear, understandable way that you can then put that into the spreadsheet and it's clear that those are the same files, you can record the metadata in the spreadsheet. And that's not a bad system. It's maybe not as foolproof as actually embedding it in the file itself, but it's often faster and it doesn't require something like a Bridge subscription.
Okay. And actually, Caitlin, I'm seeing I missed part of the question as I was scrolling, but I think you've answered it with that point about spreadsheets. So I'll just let Spencer chime in, or Spence chime in if there's additional questions. But yeah, I think that is good. Thank you.
Sure. And again, anybody wants to email me with specific questions. I know I had to be somewhat general just because there's such a wide range of materials that you might have. But if you have a specific question for me about something, please feel free to email me. Take a photo of something if you want to know what it is, and I'll see what I can do. I'm always happy to give more detailed feedback.
Well, thank you for that, Caitlin. And just a big thanks for your presentation today. I want to thank Camilla Dawson for all her help behind the scenes with today's webinar. And thanks to everybody for showing up. And I just want to say we're really excited that we just got our big NEH grant renewed. So we're going to have some, that means we're able to do more webinars, especially with external speakers, now that we have funding for that again. So stay tuned. Look forward to some new webinar content, free webinar content as always, coming up. We'll have that on our website soon. But in the meantime, hope you had a lovely afternoon. And when this window closes for today's webinar, you'll see a little survey pop up. We'd love if you fill that out and just let us know how we're doing. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks.